Hello, doctors. Today, let's talk about epidemiology. Being a physician, this chapter is very important because whenever you do some research or thesis papers, this would come in. So, every doctor must have knowledge about the epidemiology. In your school researches, you may have studied about epidemiology. So, just take a short look on how this epidemiology works. Now, to start with, first let's see about the basics of the epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of distribution, determinants, and frequency of a disease, and we then apply those facts to prevent the disease. So, we take a disease, we see how the disease is distributed, what are the determinants or its causes, and see how frequent it is occurring and find a solution to prevent it. That is basically epidemiology. Then, father of epidemiology is John Snow. John Snow is uh, famous for his work on cholera at London. Back in 1800s, there was outbreak or epidemics in the London that was due to cholera. What John Snow did was he made a spot map. He marked all the locations in London where there were epidemics of cholera and found that all those places had same water supply or water supply coming from the same place. So just like here is a water supply supplying to all the places. So cholera was found to be transmitted through water. So taking measures would prevent them. That's how they controlled the epidemics back then. The father of public health is surprisingly not a person, it is a disease, cholera. And a small question for you. In India, do you know where the National Institute of Epidemiology is located? If you know, you can write your answers in the comment box. Now, let's see about distribution of a disease. I said that we take a disease, we study about the distribution, determinants, and the factors frequency factors of a disease. But now we will see in the opposite direction. We will see about important diseases that have important distributions. Distribution, we study it according to time, place, or person. For time, we know that malaria is usually common in the rainy season. Asthma is usually seen in the winter season. For place distribution, Japanese encephalitis is commonly seen in the West Bengal, and Kala Azar is commonly seen in Bihar. Nipah virus, which we encountered recently, is seen in Kerala. And for person distribution, we see according to age or according to sex. For age distribution, it is common that measles occurs in the young, not in the elderly. Cancer is seen in the old patients. Breast cancer is seen in mostly in females, although there is 1% breast cancer cases in males. And thyroid diseases are mostly seen in females. That is how distribution of a disease works. By knowing this, we can have many preventive ideas. For example, vaccinating ourselves when going to the states, or we can be preventing malaria during rainy seasons and screening for breast cancers in females. Now let's see about the determinants of a disease. Determinants of a disease is basically cause of the disease, why and how. For example, sedentary lifestyle causes diabetes mellitus. So, to develop diabetes mellitus, it is believed that sedentary lifestyle is a cause. And sandfly is a cause for Kala Azar. Sandfly transmits the Kala Azar. And seeing the frequency of a disease. Frequency is usually seeing the incidence and prevalence of the disease. Incidence is nothing but the number of new cases reported. Prevalence is total active cases. If the patient has had the disease and if the patient is cured, then they are not counted in the prevalence. In the prevalence, only the active cases are counted. Now, with this, let's see about COVID-19 epidemiology. Now, we are taking a specific disease and seeing the distribution, determinants, and frequency of the disease. For the distribution, it was found that it started in 31 December and it's still continuing. It started at China and now it's everywhere. For person, usually it is seen with any age, but mostly in the old age are having serious cases, and it is seen in any sex. What is the cause of the disease? Some say bats and some other have many theories, but the cause is still unknown. And frequency, incidence, that is the new cases. For example, today in India there is 31,521 new cases. But prevalence is total active cases. In India there is 3,72,293 active cases. These active cases we are not including the patients who have been cured of COVID-19. So basically, after knowing the distribution, determinants and frequency of a disease, we apply them for preventing the disease in a population. That is epidemiology. For example, in COVID-19, for what are the preventive points we could do? We could stay home, we could stay away from bats if at all they were the cause, and old age people or people with comorbidities should be very careful. Now, let's see about epidemiological study. Epidemiological study is usually done for two types. Either we do an observational study or experimental study. In observational study, we have a hypothesis and we are going to test that hypothesis. Because whatever we say, we must prove it with the research. That is an observational study. Experimental study is usually, for example, when a new drug is found, we should prove that this drug is beneficial. That is experimental study. Observational study is of two types: descriptive study and analytical study. Descriptive study is hypothesis formulation. Hypothesis is nothing but a thought or a fact which is not proven yet. So, you may think a hypothesis, I may think a hypothesis, but we must prove the hypothesis. That is important. That is hypothesis testing. For example, I say that smoking causes lung cancer. I have formulated a hypothesis. Then I have to prove that smoking causes lung cancer with this analytical studies. We can either choose a cohort study, case control study, cross-sectional study, or ecological study. I will talk about all these next. Then, for example, if you have found a drug, for example drug X for lung cancer, I have to intervene and prove that this drug is beneficial. This is hypothesis confirmation. This is, do not mix up this with this. Now let's talk only about this. Now we have done the hypothesis confirmation for the drug. We can do that using a randomized control trial, a clinical trial, community trial, or a field trial. So this is the basis or the root of epidemiological study. You should know this table properly. Now, as we saw before, let's first talk about the cohort study. For example, I say that smoking causes lung cancer, so I should prove it. For that, what I do is I do a cohort study. Cohort study is nothing but I take 100 smokers and follow them for 20 years. Because lung cancer is not going to develop in a day. I follow up these patients for 20 years. This is just an example. You can follow as much as you want. Then see how many get lung cancer. In my study, I followed 100 smokers and 80 turned out to have lung cancer in 20 years. So, people who smoked are called as the exposed group. They are exposed to the smoke. And non-smokers. If we prove that smoking causes lung cancer, then I have to also prove that if you don't smoke, you won't have lung cancer. So I take 100 non-smokers, I follow up them for 20 years parallelly when I follow this group, and I see that only 10 get lung cancer. So I found that if you don't smoke, the chances of lung cancer is less. These are non-exposed group. Now we have to calculate the strength of association. I said that if you don't smoke, the chances of you having lung cancer is very less. But what is that chance exactly? How much is it? So that's how we calculate the strength of association, to see how much it is connected. That is, how much is smoking connected to lung cancer. First we can do relative risk. Relative risk is incidence of disease in exposed by incidence of disease in non-exposed. Here if you see incidence of disease, lung cancer in exposed, incidence is 80, exposed or 100. So 80 by 100. Then incidence of disease in non-exposed. If you see 100 or non-exposed, but incidence of disease is only 10. So 10 by 100. If we do the calculation, we get relative risk as 8. So we say that smokers have 8 times higher chance of having lung cancer compared to non-smokers. This is how exactly you are required to tell. Now, this relative risk, if you are getting more than 1, for example in this case relative risk is 8, then that is association present. If relative risk is 1, then there is no association. If relative risk is less than 1, then there is inverse association. That is, the risk factor is actually protecting the patient. For example, you might have learned that smoking is protective in ulcerative colitis, because when the study was done, the relative risk was less than 1. So they said that if you smoke, the chances of you having ulcerative colitis is less. So this is relative risk. We can also do attributable risk. Attributable risk is incidence of disease in exposed minus incidence of disease in non-exposed divided by incidence of disease in exposed into 100. If you see incidence of disease 80 in exposed 100, 80 by 100. Incidence of disease in non-exposed 10 by 100. Then again in exposed 80 by 100 into 100. We get 88%. We can say that 88% of lung cancer is attributed to smoking. Then next we do population attributable risk. In this, we do incidence of disease in total, incidence of disease in non-exposed, divided by incidence of disease in total. If you see total, there are 200 samples. 100 are exposed group, 100 are non-exposed group. So we have 200 samples or 200 subjects. In that 200, how many got lung cancer? 80 plus 10, 90. So 90 by 200 divided by 90 by 200 minus 10 by 100, that is incidence of disease in non-exposed. Then incidence of disease in total times 100, we get population attributable risk of 77. So this means if we eliminate smoking, there will be 77% reduction of new cases in lung cancer in the population. That is population attributable risk. So if you are doing a cohort study, you are required to do this relative risk, attributable risk and population attributable risk to see how much is it related. Then next we can do case control study. If you see the cohort study we did, it took 20 years. So it is a bit time consuming. So it is not advised, no, it is very difficult and costly for people to do. So what people did is case control study. Instead of following up patients, they directly took 100 lung cancer patients and they asked his history and saw how many were smokers. They also took 100 healthy people and asked history how many were smokers. Because, like before, if you say smoking causes lung cancer, you should say that if you don't smoke, you won't have lung cancer. So, in 100 lung cancer patients, on asking history, like instead of following up 20 years, I ask, oh, how do you were smoker before 20 years? And 75 turned out to say yes. And in 100 healthy patients, I ask history, you were a smoker 20 years? They say only 15 were smokers in that 100. With this, you just in a day, you can say that smoking is related to lung cancer instead of following up for 20 years. But these also have some advantages and disadvantages. Case control study has many different names. It is backward looking study because we are asking history, or retrospective study, we are going backwards, or effect to cause study, or disease to risk factor study, or outcome to exposure study. So just like this, the opposite name is given for cohort study. Like cohort study is called as forward looking study, prospective study, cause to effect study, risk factor to disease study, exposure to outcome study, follow up study, or incidence study. Now let's see how to calculate the strength of association in case control study. Here we do odds ratio. This table is really important. Whenever you are calculating odds ratio, you are required to draw this table, and you in the top you mark disease present, disease absent, risk factor present, risk factor absent. With this given history, you have to draw this table. See how many had disease that was due to risk factor. 100 had disease but due to risk factor is 75. Then see how many had disease but they did not have any risk factor. Like how many had lung cancers but they did not have smoking, that is 25, because 75 were smokers in the 100 lung cancers. So 75 minus 100 is 25. 25 were non-smokers, yet they developed lung cancer. Next, if you see how many did not have disease and were healthy, but they had the risk factor, that is smoking, 15. If you see here 15, They did not have disease, they were healthy and they were smokers. But here, how many did not have the disease but also were not smoking? 15 minus 100 is 85. So draw this table first. Then to calculate the odds ratio, we do AD by BC. AD by BC, just like this, AD by BC. So 75 times 85 divided by 15 times 12, 25. This is odds ratio 17. Now odds ratio 17, what does it mean? It means that lung cancer patients have 17 times higher chances of giving a history of smoking compared to healthy people. By this, we can say that smoking caused lung cancer. Then cross-sectional study. This is done at a point of time, so called a snapshot study. It is not followed up or asked history. It is just done at this point of time. Right now, how many smoke and how many have lung cancer? With this, we can find the prevalence. How many have the disease? So that is why cross-sectional study is used. Then ecological study. It is usually done on total population instead of doing on 100 or individual cases. So this result cannot be applied on individuals. It is usually used for nutritional studies in the population. For example, Western women have high fat intake. If you say Western women have high fat intake, that does not say that each individual woman has high fat intake. It is just a general opinion. So that is called as ecological fallacy. This result cannot be applied on individuals. That is ecological fallacy. Let's also talk about some important high yield concepts. What is a confounder? Confounder is something that is related both to exposure and to outcome. If you see, alcohol is causing esophageal cancer. Alcohol is the exposure, esophageal cancer is the outcome. A confounder is related to both exposure and to outcome. Here, smoking is a confounder. If you see, whenever people drink alcohol, they tend to smoke. So, the chances of getting esophageal cancer increases. But also that not only alcohol, smoking individually causes esophageal cancer. So, if we are doing a study, alcohol and esophageal cancer, and if we do not include smoking, then that becomes a confounder, because people while drinking alcohol may be also smoking. That increases the chances of esophageal cancer, and we think that alcohol is causing more and more of esophageal cancer, but the confounder was smoking. What is effect modifier? It is related only to outcome but not with exposure. If you see, coffee drinking caused pancreatitis. Coffee is exposure, pancreatitis is outcome. And alcohol is an effect modifier, because whenever people drink coffee, they do not drink alcohol with it. So, alcohol is not related to coffee but is related to pancreatitis. So, we are doing a research on coffee drinkers and pancreatitis, but that person may also be an alcoholic, which tend to increase the chance of pancreatitis, and we may wrongly think that coffee is highly a causative agent for pancreatitis. But the difference between confounder and effect modifier is that confounder was related to both exposure and outcome, but effect modifier is only related to outcome and not with exposure. Then bias. Bias are systematic errors in study. There are many types of bias. For example, recall bias. In case control study, I said that we have to ask history to patients. So, patients may recall or may not recall. that may cause a bias. Interviewer bias. The interviewer may ask questions as he wishes. For example, he may ask more and more questions to people who had lung cancer, and he just asked less questions to people who did not have lung cancer. Hawthorne bias. Hawthorne bias is when you know that you are being in a research, so that to create a good impression, you change your habits and try to be a good person. That is generally good, but it is going to affect the results of the research. Bergsonian bias is hospital admission bias. And these are also some other types of bias which you may study. So that was basically about the observational studies. We saw about the cohort, case control, cross-sectional and ecological studies, and we also saw about some important points like confounder, effect modifier and bias. Now let's talk about experimental study. First talk about RCT, randomized control trial. For example, if you are finding a new drug XYZ for lung cancer, it is not enough. We must prove that this drug is really effective in curing lung cancer. So to check that, we do a randomized control trial. So what do? We take 100 lung cancer patients and put 50 of them in experimental group and 50 in control groups. We do this randomly. We randomly assign 50 to experimental and 50 to control group, and also do blinding. Blinding is something that when patients or the person doesn't know what they are taking. For example, we are giving drug XYZ in 50 patients and seeing the result, and we give placebo in 50 control groups and seeing the results. This placebo, these 50 don't know that they are taking a placebo. That is blinding. This 50 also don't know that they are taking the real drug. This is also blinding. What do? We check this group and this group and compare the results and see if the drug is really working or not. That is randomized control trial in short. Then we do clinical trials. To launch a new drug in market, first we must pass the clinical trials. Preclinical trials are the ones that are usually done in animals. You must have seen the lab rats. Those are used for preclinical trials. After the preclinical trial, we do the clinical trial. There are broadly 4 phases. Phase 1 is done in healthy human volunteers, like 100 people. This is usually for checking the safety, non-toxicity and maximum tolerable dose pharmacokinetics of the drug. Then we do the second phase in patients, like 200 to 400 patients. This is to check the efficacy of the drug. In phase 3, again we do it on patients, but now in thousands to 5,000s. This is to compare the old drug with the existing drug, because we have to prove that this new drug is better than the already present drug, so that it will be sold in the market. Because basically, if the drug is not very good compared to before, then no one is going to use it. So that drug should be better. After this phase 3, the drug will be released in the market. Phase 4 is usually done in patients to check for the post-marketing surveillance and to know rare and long-term side effects. These are basically the 4 phases of the clinical trial. So that was our short discussion on the topic epidemiology, and there are many more to come in the next few videos. But don't forget the question that I asked before. Where is the location of National Institute of Epidemiology in India? Which city is it located in? Comment down your answers. So that's all for today. Thank you. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, then do subscribe.